Hi. Israel used to fight really big tank battles in the desert, and it won those battles relatively easily. And today it fights small, dug-in groups in dense cities that fire thousands of rockets at civilians. Frankly, the IDF has found this to be a far more difficult task than taking on large Arab armies. And it's really hard to say that Israel has really won any of these conflicts that it's fought in, like, let's say, the last 20 years. It's not even clear anymore what victory would even look like. So the Israeli army a few years ago rewrote its doctrine, and it created something called the concept of victory and a big rebuilding plan called Tnufa, or momentum. Now in this video we're going to look at three things. One, what IDF doctrine actually is today, and I'm thinking about specifically about this victory concept and the Tnufa or momentum plan. Two, how much the Gaza war has followed or broken that doctrine. And three, what my favorite military strategist, French General André Beaufre, might say about all this, about Israel's doctrine and about how it has fought in Gaza. Spoiler alert, my conclusion is that the current Israeli military doctrine is garbage, and I think that its flaws to a significant extent are to blame for Israel's lack of anything that one might reasonably describe as success in Gaza. Now, if you're new here, my name is Michael Shirkin, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana. I know the name is increasingly ironic, but whatever. It's a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be on my mind. Who am I? I'm a history PhD, former CIA analyst, former RAND Corporation senior political scientist, I think that's what they called me. And these days I actually work for a small business intelligence firm that has a focus on Africa. In my free time, I like to hold forth about all sorts of topics like Israeli doctrine in front of my camera. First, for some context, I've been skirting around this subject for a while. Maybe 10 years ago, I led a study at the RAND Corporation that looked at French Army approaches to network warfare. I've got a link to that study. Well, not above me. I've got a link to the study in the description. It's a cool study. But anyways, that introduced me to the whole concept of networked warfare and how it promised, according to the evangelists of the stuff, that promised to completely revolutionize warfare. This was going to be part of the revolution in military affairs and transformation, all that kind of thing. The best, by the way, expression of that vision in any language that I can read happens to be that written by the French General Guy Hubin in the year 2000, whom I interviewed on this channel. His books, unfortunately, have not been translated into English, so if you only read English, the best you can do at present is simply to read my article about General Hubin that I wrote for War on the Rocks a few years ago in an article called Kill the Homothetic Army. And I've got a link to that also in the description. I believe I'm the only person to have written about Hubin in English. Okay, what does this have to do with Israel? Well, first of all, two things. For the last 2 decades or so, all Western armies, and probably lots of others, have been investing a lot of money into networked warfare technology. And all sort of for this promise that this would revolutionize everything. But honestly, nobody really has any good practical experience regarding how well any of this worked and if it actually delivered. Is it as revolutionary as promised, or is it oversold? It just so happens that the country that happens to be the furthest along in terms of its integration of this military technology also happens to be one of the few countries with any real-world recent experience using this stuff in combat. I'm talking, of course, about, you guessed it, the Israeli military. So I've long been curious, how's it going? What has it done? Is it any good? Has it done anything? Has it done bad things? Now, secondly, and the reason why I think this is important is that a lot of us who've been watching the war in Gaza have had a hard time trying to figure out what the IDF has been doing and why, in large part because it's really hard to argue that the IDF has won or is winning anything in particular after 2 years of war. Maybe a year ago, I interviewed the journalist Seth Frantzman, and I put a link to that interview above here so you can see it. Great interview. One of the things that he noted in a book that he wrote about the war in Gaza, and also during the interview, he says that there's really little evidence of an overall strategy on the part of the Israelis. It's very important. I'll come back to that. Also, he assessed that the Israeli army was not doing what it should have been doing according to its new fighting doctrine. Now, this piqued my curiosity. What is that fighting doctrine? I didn't really know what this was. And what should IDF operations look like if the IDF, in fact, was putting that doctrine into practice? And then, perhaps the biggest question of all, or the biggest questions of all, is the doctrine any good? And are there any flaws in the doctrine? And maybe the doctrine, either the strengths or the weaknesses, might explain why the Gaza war has been so fruitless relative to the time, effort, and expense in blood and treasure. So let's start with the basics. For decades after 1948, the IDF's doctrine was really pretty simple. Israel is a tiny state surrounded by much bigger enemies, so it has to win quickly, offensively, and decisively. And the classic answer was a powerful reserve-based ground force, high mobility and deep maneuver into enemy territory. Basically, blitzkrieg. Like, this is straight out of Guderian's playbook, or the Kesselschlacht. But the Air Force providing a superior air superiority and fire support. The model worked pretty well in the big state-on-state wars that Israel fought, especially in 1967, of course, and also in 1973. But from the 1990s onward, the main threat changed. Groups like Hezbollah and Hamas stopped trying to match Israel tank for tank. Instead, they built large rocket and missile arsenals. They dug into dense urban areas and tunnels. They using humans as shields. They accepted long, grinding confrontations as a strategy. And they combined this, they did this in order to constrict Israel's liberty of action. The 2006 Lebanon war and repeated Gaza rounds showed a pattern. Despite overwhelming technological supremacy, Israel struggled to get clear, fast, strategic outcomes, while its own cities absorbed prolonged rocket fire. Now, inside the IDF, what happened after 2006 is that there was a multi-year study that they did, and they concluded that the whole system of building the force and structuring the Israeli military, while it was very advanced, it was structurally overly conservative. They decided, service-centric and slow to change. And it wasn't very good at generating what they called system-level effects against these quote-unquote terror armies. Now, system-level effects. The term effects should remind us all of the American concept that emerged, I believe, in the early 2000s, something called effects-based operations, or EBO. This became very in vogue in the U.S. military in the 2000s, and it caught on very quickly in Israel. Effects-based operations basically are an approach to planning and conducting campaigns, military campaigns, that starts from the effects you want to produce in the enemy system, and then you work backwards to pick the actions, military and non-military, that can create those effects, ideally with the least necessary use of force. So it's not necessarily about conquering terrain. It's not necessarily about destroying the enemy's armed forces. It's about achieving certain effects on the systems of the enemy, and then figuring out what it takes to build to have those effects and to impose those effects upon the military. And that's the background in which emerged the IDF's new concept of victory, as well its Tnufa, or momentum force planning program. So all this happened in the 2019-2020 timeframe under Chief of Staff Aviv Kochavi. The IDF published two key documents. One is this conceptual paper called the Operational Concept for Victory. And then there's the Tnufa, or momentum, which is a multi-year plan. The victory concept is the theory, how the IDF defines victory against today's enemies and how it wants to fight. Tnufa is a long-term program to build a force that can actually fight the way the concept of victory paper says that they should fight. So, what does the victory concept say? I have not been able to read the actual document, the victory concept. I don't believe it's ever been released publicly, so it's classified. Some bits have been released, and then mainly what I've done is there are a lot of articles in IDF publications that the IDF has published, and as well as journalistic stuff about it, that describes it and discusses it. And basically what I did was extrapolate from what I read about it to give you an idea, or to get an idea of what the document itself actually says. But alas, I've not been able to get my hands on the actual document. So what does this thing say? First of all, it redefines the enemy. So in the old days, the enemy was modeled as a regular Arab army with tanks, front lines, limited ability to strike deep into Israel, etc. Now the main army is described as a rocket-based terror army. It means hybrid organizations like Hezbollah and Hamas. These things have large inventories of rockets and missiles aimed at Israeli cities, and they have dense defensive systems in urban and subterranean terrain. They've got high-rise firing points, tunnels, bunkers, etc. Plus, they are backed by Iran, and they're able to adapt quickly with cheap civilian technology like drones and commercial communications. This becomes now the strategy. It's not defeating Israel on the battleground. It's basically you keep firing at Israel's home front as much as you can, and then you do everything you can to leverage media and diplomacy against Israel. And that's the way that you limit Israel's liberty of action and undermine Israel's strength. So their entire strategy consists of surviving and consists of provoking Israel to do things that cause civilian suffering, and then to use the resulting suffering to fuel what Beaufre would call an external maneuver outside of the theater of conflict, intended to limit Israel's liberty of action and to tie its hands through public and diplomatic pressure. So the heart of the problem from the Israeli point of view, in terms of the Israeli analysis in this whole concept of victory, is time and continuous rocket fire, not tanks on the borders. What they do is, in this victory concept, they come up with three measurable parameters. They're defining victory according to three measurable parameters. The first is achievement, which is not just, I kept reading, not just seizing ground, in fact, maybe not even seizing ground, but the systematic dismantling of the enemy's military system. You're going after the system. This is, again, effects-based operations. Rocket arrays, command and control, logistics, elite units, so that they can't sustain meaningful combat. 2, time. You want to compress the campaign so that the enemy can't turn a long war into strategic leverage. Don't fight a long war, make it short. And so what you want to do, the doctrine talks about massively degrading the enemy's rocket capabilities in a matter of days rather than weeks. And then 3 is price, keeping Israeli casualties and the home front damage at below a level that might break public resilience and make Israelis feel that the war isn't worth it. This is a really big deal. Israel is extremely casualty sensitive, which explains, among other things, Israel's preference for armor and firepower, because in reality, in battle, if you want to keep your people safe, the best way to do it is by using a lot of firepower and armor, that kind of thing. Anyway, so to put simply, victory means the enemy's rocket-based strategy visibly fails, the war is short, and the price Israel pays, while painful, is still acceptable. The concept explicitly rejects the old pattern of deterrence operations, or what they used to call mowing the grass, which refers to limited rounds that never aim at decisive victory and often would just allow Hamas and Hezbollah to adapt and to rebuild. So instead, it's like managing the problem without ever actually solving the problem. The doctrine says that the true test is the ability to defeat a terror army like Hezbollah or Hamas quickly, at an acceptable cost, and in an irrefutable way. That's the idea. Now, to reach that kind of victory, the concept pushes 3 big operational ideas. 1, multi-domain blows. So operations are organized as multi-domain packages: ground, air, naval, intelligence, cyber, electronic warfare, all hitting one enemy system at a time, like a rocket brigade or a tunnel complex, instead of just supporting a ground advance. 2, a smart suite. Instead of rebuilding the army from scratch, you want to take the army that you have, but you want to dress it all in a digital layer where you're linking everybody, and you've got drones and sensors and networks and AI, which is connecting sensors to shooters, down to the battalion, to the company level. All about speeding up the OODA loop. That's something I'm going to be repeating in this video. It's all about speeding up the OODA loop as fast as you can. And this should help enable troops to locate what they call disappearing enemies in cities and tunnels, and to kill targets much faster than before. So it's all about this. It's by disappearing enemies, disappearing adversaries. This refers to this idea that, you're in a city and you're fighting, and there you see them, you see the bad guys. But before you can call for fires and then get the fires and do all these things, this moment is going to go away and you're going to lose your opportunity. So you want to speed up this whole system such that you can get fires on target as soon as possible, so that you can get them before they disappear. They go out of sight, or they scurry into a tunnel or a bunker or something like that. Another aspect of this is you want to negate enemy fire. The main operational goal here then becomes shutting down rockets and missiles, and not just to occupy land, which means you locate the launchers and the firing cells quickly. It's got to be fast, and you have to destroy them, often at the moment of launch, when they're exposed. As soon as you perceive a rocket launch, you get it. Or ideally even before the rockets launch, when you see them setting up the rocket launcher, something like that. But it's got to be fast, 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 fast. Everything's about the speed. Next, we have Tnufa, or momentum. Tnufa is the IDF's multi-year plan, which they launched in around 2020. Whereas the victory concept is the theory, Tnufa is the build out for how to put the theory into place. Apparently what they did is they had a whole bunch of multi-service teams that formed, and each started from missions defined by the victory concept. Kind of like effects-based operations where they design capabilities backwards from the effects that the IDF wanted on the battlefield. You start with the effect, something you want to be able to do to the enemy's system, and then you define the battlefield requirements, like what the capabilities, what are you going to need from all the services to be able to achieve that, and then you figure out how to do that. So you don't just ask the Navy what it wants, or the Air Force what it wants, or the Army what it wants. You think, what is the effect we want? How do we achieve that? And part of that, then you eyeball it and you think, well, in order to be able to do this, the Army needs to have this, the Air Force needs to have that, and the Navy needs to have that other thing. Structurally, Tnufa puts multi-domain maneuver, multi-domain strike, and multi-domain defense at the center. It elevates enablers, things like digital networks, intelligence, cyber, spectrum, realistic training, from support functions to core pillars. It fuses maneuver and fire. Ground forces and precision, air and long-range fires become parallel, tightly integrated lines of effort, and not a simple support hierarchy. Very much like what Hubin wrote in his book about, with the kill the homothetic army. And ultimately, this is all about speeding up the OODA loop as much as possible, using the tech as well as organizing everything so that lower echelons are highly networked and could quickly avail themselves of the full panoply of combined arms and joint support. And they had these flagship model units that they were setting up, like these test beds. There's something called the Ghost, I think it's a brigade. It's a multi-domain unit that they created in order to embody these different ideas at the tactical level, where you've got these permanent teams that mix infantry and armor and engineers with air assets and drones and robotics and advanced C2 command and control, all to generate a super fast sensor to shooter cycle. The cycle between a sensor senses a threat and the information is fed to a shooter that takes action, and just speed it up as much as possible. That's the doctrine on paper, which brings us to part two, which is that, well, how did this all play out in Gaza for reals? To some extent, especially at the tactical level, a lot of what the IDF did in Gaza fits the victory concept and Tnufa. We've got multi-domain tactics and this whole smart suite thing going on with all the tech. So I read that in dense areas like Jabalia and Sheikh Radwan, you had these ghost multi-domain units operating exactly as Tnufa envisioned. They seize key terrain, key buildings, fill the area with drones and sensors, and then directed tanks and mortars and airstrikes and engineers in a very fast cycle against rocket launching teams and tunnels and local command posts. That's what they're up to. DEF and external reports also describe extensive use of AI-assisted target generation and a rich digital network that enabled very high target volumes. Thousands of targets across Gaza, with some sources citing around 11,000 AI-assisted targets. This is exactly the smart suite idea. You use the tech to enable units to find quickly and hit quickly, disappearing ephemeral enemy in a very complex terrain. Now, of course, this whole system got a lot of bad press, and it creates this debate about whether or not the Israelis went too far, because the system is geared for speed. The idea is that you very quickly hammer the enemy all over the place, right? And you do it really fast. And anytime you see a threat or perceive a threat, you have this very fast cycle in order to act upon the threat. But that, of course, has unintended consequences. The emphasis on speed, I'm pretty sure, I don't know for a fact, but I'm pretty sure it discourages the humans that are in the loop. Israeli policy, like all other Western militaries, is that there must be a human in the loop, meaning that these cycles can't be entirely automatic. The technology exists for these things to be completely automatic, but a human has to be there to decide to pull the trigger or not. It's somewhere in that chain, there has to be a human sitting there and making decisions. But the question is, how much leeway does the human have? How much time is the human given? What kind of pressure is the human under? What are the criteria that the human are given? What's the level of inspection, the level of scrutiny, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I suspect that in this kind of operational tempo that the Israelis are going for, it discourages the humans, whatever humans are in the loop, from pausing or hesitating or asking more questions. I think, for instance, that in a nutshell, that's what happened to those, the World Central Kitchen aid workers that got killed. Something triggered the sensors, which initiated a sensor-to-shooter chain that moved too fast for anybody in the loop to say, hey, wait a minute, what exactly are we firing at? In theory, that's the way it's supposed to work, that there should be people who pause, right? Like, no, collateral damage risk is too great. No this, no this. Or I don't think that is an enemy, right? Maybe that's not a terrorist. Maybe that's this. Maybe that's that. But it seems highly likely to me that in that sort of high-pressure, fast-paced environment of this kind of modern battlefield, where the emphasis is on speed, is that that kind of scrutiny just isn't happening, perhaps to the extent that it really should. But I feel like that's a separate debate. And this is a debate that I think all militaries ultimately are having, because our militaries are under pressure. Everybody believes that you need speed and that you want to speed up the OODA loop as much as possible. The best way to speed up the OODA loop is by automating things as much as possible. And things like AI, machine learning, make it easier to do that by offloading of much of the task of identifying targets and doing the targeting work onto the computers, onto the AI. But at the same time, the more automated it becomes, the more problematic it becomes in terms of ethics, law. Plus also, if you can figure out how to trigger your adversary's algorithm into launching a fire mission, then you can play havoc on all sorts of things. You could maybe create friendly fire incidents, or you can trigger the enemy into bombing a school or a hospital by doing certain things that trigger the system. I have no idea if any of this happened in Gaza. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying, it's a very tricky thing that I think all militaries are working on. The other thing, another aspect that we saw was this idea of multi-domain blows against systems. So, for instance, we saw these large attacks against tunnel systems, which involved airstrikes, ground maneuver, specialized engineers working together to collapse major underground complexes that were being used as command hubs in logistics arteries. And also we saw this ghost unit that was supposed to be like a model, and it was able to deliver these fast blows at short notice and then feed the lessons and the information back to the wider force. We also saw an emphasis on negating enemy fire. We saw that the operational narratives, the stories that came out of Gaza that emphasized hunting of rocket launch teams, destroying storage and production sites, hitting command facilities that control rocket fire, etc. We saw units involved in attract and strike tactics where tanks and infantry would deliberately expose themselves in order to draw out Hamas cells, and then air and artillery would close the fire circle, in other words, to hit these people once they're exposed. Very much in line with the victory concepts focus on shutting down the fire systems of the enemy rather than simply holding the terrain. So you're not holding the terrain, you're not grabbing the terrain or controlling the terrain. You're trying to attack the enemy systems, and you're trying to shut down the enemy systems as much as possible. So at this level, I would argue that Gaza looks a lot like a genuine application of the new fighting doctrine. However, at another level, the Gaza operations broke with the doctrine in some very significant ways. So if we go back to this whole definition, remember we defined, according to the victory concept, you define victory in terms of these three metrics of achievement: time, the less time the better, and price, the less price the better. I would argue that this is where things really fell apart, certainly in terms of time and also in terms of price. And remember, because doctrine is not just about tactics, it's also about the campaign design and ultimately about strategy. So here the Gaza war looks a lot more mixed, shall we say. First of all, time. This turned into a long war. The victory concept insists that war should be short and intense. Destroy the enemy's rocket-based system in a few days or weeks to avoid a long, grinding confrontation. That didn't really work out. It turned into a prolonged multi-phase campaign with extended fighting, repeated escalations, a lot of like rinse and repeat, capturing and sweeping the same terrain over and over again, which is part of why Gaza looks the way it does, because the same terrain was fought over multiple times. Plus, there's this long continued strain on Israel's home front, the economy, the reserves. And the war ends up resembling more and more the earlier pre-2023 rounds of grass mowing than the short, decisive war that the doctrine had in mind. In fact, we're really back to grass mowing operations. We're mowing the grass. We're not inflicting any kind of decisive defeat upon the enemy. Then if you talk about costs in the price, it becomes clear that this was supposed to be low cost. This turns out to be very high cost. Doctrine says that victory must be achieved while keeping Israeli casualties and the home front casualties and home front damage below a threshold that would undermine public resilience or make people doubt the war's worth. In reality, Israel suffered very heavy losses, especially on 7 October, and also significant casualties afterwards, while its cities absorbed sustained rocket fire, and its economy was significantly disrupted by long mobilization. That was never supposed to happen. And of course, on the Palestinian side, we've got massive casualties and destruction in Gaza, which reached extreme levels, which triggered intense diplomatic and legal pressure, which all had the effect of narrowing Israel's liberty of action. The achievement in the end was severe damage, but not any kind of clean dismantlement or anything that looks compelling or decisive. The IDF did manage to inflict severe damage on Hamas, and lots of tunnels and command sites were destroyed, and lots of fighters were killed, and commanders were killed, and a large portion of its rocket arsenal and infrastructure was hit. But all the analyses I read note that Hamas has retained some command and organizational capacity. It's been able to continue to fire rockets into Israel long into the war, and it's kept political and social influence in parts of Gaza. This all falls short of the Doctrine's vision of clearly, irrefutably dismantling the enemy's rocket army system. So you could say the following: tactically and operationally, Gaza shows strong implementation of Tnufa and the victory concept. Strategically, the war diverged from the Doctrine's ideal. It was long, costly, and politically contentious, and it did not produce the kind of short, decisive outcome the concept promised. Which brings me to part 3 of this video. What would a classic strategist make of all this? Enter André Beaufre, my favorite military strategist. So Beaufre, I've talked about him in many videos. He was a mid-century French general. He fought in the Rif War in the 20s or 20s. He fought in World War II. He fought through all of World War II, and he fought in Algeria and Indochina. He was commander in Suez. He saw a lot. The main book to read is he's got this wonderful book called Introduction to Strategy. I've put a link to the English translation, a PDF of an English translation in the description that you may peruse. And of course, if you read French, go and buy yourself a copy of the book itself. But by the way, also I wrote about, now I give a very, I think if I dare say so myself, a good introduction to Beaufre in an article I wrote about Beaufre for War on the Rocks. So again, link in the description about that. He had several core ideas that are relevant. First of all, there is the idea that strategy must be total. He talked in terms of a grand strategy or total strategy, in which military strategy is but one piece. There's also political strategy and economic strategy and a diplomatic strategy and psychological strategy. For him, all war was ultimately psychological warfare, because it's ultimately about attacking the enemy's will to fight and figuring out how you actually do that. So you can't just think in terms of battlefield moves, battlefield maneuvers. It's not just about the fighting. It's got to be about the politics, the diplomacy, the economics, the psychological stuff. Good strategy preserves your freedom of action, your liberty of action, as you put it, and limits the enemies using the smallest necessary amount of force. In many modern conflicts, he also argued, you should favor an indirect strategy rather than a direct one. A direct one would be like, go straight at him. You aim at indirect strategy, you go around, but also you do things that attack the enemy's will or its freedom of action, not just at his forces, right, but also about the political constraints. And it's really important when your political constraints are tight. Politically, there's a lot of stuff you can't do, so you've got a little bit of margin for maneuver, and then you've got to use this as a window to get at the enemy indirectly. According to Beaufre, you must always align means and ends, which means, among other things, that you must define the political end state that you want, right? The purpose of war is not war for war's sake, but it's to achieve a desired political end state. So you have to be able to clearly define that. And then you have to design a total strategy that serves that end, of which there is a military strategy, and not the other way around. It's not the military strategy is the one that determines everything else. No, the military strategy is nothing but a means to achieve a larger end. Now, with all that in mind, what might he say about Israeli doctrine and Gaza? And some of this I've actually already addressed in previous videos that have talked about Gaza and strategy, and I've referenced Beaufre and another French strategist guy named Castex. And I've put links to some of this content in the description below. But I mean, on one hand, Beaufre would probably admire the intellectual effort here that the Israelis put into this about the doctrinal work, the idea that they made an effort to rethink their enemy, to think realistically, to redefine, to understand how it's a different kind of war, different kind of enemy, and redefine how you define victory, come up with it in measurable terms, rather than vague ideas of deterrence. And also that the Israelis recognized that mowing the grass exercises were a dead end, and that the real test was a decisive victory, somehow achieved quickly and at acceptable cost. But then the critique would begin, and I think that Beaufre would insist, because Beaufre insisted that grand strategy has to be total, right? You have to integrate political, psychological, economic, and diplomatic actions with the military ones. This has to be done at the outset. And I think that he would say that victory, the victory concept that the Israelis wrote in 2019, 2020, is far too operational. Brilliantly answers the question how to crush a rocket army fast, but pays much less attention, in fact, no attention whatsoever, to the political order that should follow in Gaza and how military moves must support that wider end state. The point of war is to bring about a desired political end state. And if you can't define that political end state, you shouldn't go to war. So what's the end state? From my point of view, my understanding of what happened in Gaza is that Israel's government, for political reasons, could not define the desired political end state because it could not commit to one, because that would have had to commit it to one of several options, none of which were politically tenable given the dynamics of the Israeli political system. So, for instance, one option is that you want to get rid of Hamas, which means you ultimately have to replace Hamas with something. So one option is that you place it with Israel. So basically, Israel should assume full responsibility for governing Gaza and administering it, and responsibility for the livelihoods, the well-being of everybody under its control. That's one option. There are a lot of really good reasons not to do that. So that's kind of ruled out. Another option is to stand up some form of self-government to replace that of Hamas. This gets dicey, right? Because this basically means you got to sort of stand up a Palestinian state, which politically, given some of the parties that are part of the governing coalition, that's not acceptable either. And also, concretely, how do you do this? Are you going to bring in the Palestinian Authority, which in many ways is considered discredited and illegitimate by some? Do you create another thing? Do you create, like I've often written that you needed to create some sort of, what's it called, Manchukuo, this Japanese puppet state in Manchuria during World War II. I mean, it's a bad look, but something like that, anything, right? Because if you don't put something in place, then all you're doing is you've created a vacuum and allowed what's left of Hamas to fill the vacuum. So you have to have something in there. But this is something that, for political reasons, the Israeli government can't commit doing, which means it's not really doing anything. And here's a basic problem that I see with the victory concept: the emphasis on attacking capabilities rather than controlling ground. Because Israel, as far as I can tell, can only win this fight if it controls the ground. And it can only do that by replacing the government. First of all, occupying the ground, staying. You conquer territory and you stay in that territory. Whereas it looks to me like what the IDF did is they would roll in, they would clear the territory, and then eventually they would leave, which means that the people, so they'd clear the people, they would kill whoever Hamas stayed behind, and then eventually they would leave, and then the population would come back, and along with them, and also Hamas fighters would come back. So what have they actually achieved? Nothing. You need to take the ground, and then you need to hold the ground. And ultimately, you can only do that by replacing the government with itself or with another, right? The people come in, you have to deal with their security, you have to feed them, you have to do all sorts of things. Who's going to do that? You need somebody to do it other than Hamas, because if you don't do it or you don't give somebody else the job, then Hamas is going to do it. If you're just focused on attacking capabilities, that is a means to an end, but it's not the end in itself. And that's really it in a nutshell. Israel mistook the means for an end, and they thought that the means to achieving the end was the end in and of itself. Israeli leaders couldn't commit to either option and had, for various reasons, wanted to avoid all the really good options. So what they did, in effect, was not to decide and ultimately not have a strategy. Because if you you can't have a strategy if you don't know what you're trying to achieve in the first place, and if you can't decide that what you're trying to achieve. And of course, this is all complicated by there's always a profound tension in the whole campaign between just trying to destroy the enemy and trying to save hostages, negotiating with the hostages versus persecuting the war. And this was reflected in hesitations about ceasefires. You want to negotiate for ceasefires and prisoner release in order to get hostages released. On the other hand, ceasefires would help preserve Hamas. So there's a conflict there. How do you resolve this dilemma? And these are just adding to the dilemmas that the Israeli state had to govern, had to grapple with. Now, I know that a number of people, in looking at what happened in Gaza, would see a nefarious motive. That one argument is like the reason why the Israelis did what they did is ultimately because they just want to kill as many people as possible. I think it's completely ludicrous. So many examples. It's so clear to me that was not the objective at all. It largely having to do with the fact that one of the reasons why the war went as slowly as it did was that they were clearing out population and moving them to another place so that they could fight in an area to minimize the casualties amongst the people. If they were trying to kill people, you don't clear the population out. You let them stay there. And interestingly enough, whenever they would move people from one neighborhood to another, everybody would, how can you do that? It's like they're asking the Israelis to have the civilians stay where they're fighting, which would only increase the civilian casualties. So what do you want? Anyway, that's not it. There's another argument that people make, which is that Netanyahu was doing what he was doing because ultimately he wants Hamas to survive, and he needs that for his own political survival. I don't want that to be true. I don't think you can prove it, but I can't disprove it either. But my sense of like the Occam's razor, like my go-to answer is that it was none of the above. It's rather they had a deeply flawed doctrine operating in the absence of a strategy, and they didn't have a strategy because having a strategy would have required the Israeli government to make political decisions that, for internal political reasons, it was not up to making. So back to Beaufre. Setting aside his critique of the doctrine, let's talk about his view of Gaza, what his view of Gaza might have been. He really drew a very sharp line between direct strategy, which often amounted to applying massive force straight at the enemy, and an indirect strategy which focuses on shaping the enemy's freedom of action, limiting it, and often you want to limit the enemy's freedom of action while increasing your own or preserving your own, and often you do this with very limited military moves, and a heavy emphasis on politics, on psychology, and the external maneuver. External maneuver, of course, being the thing that you do outside the theater of war, like in the international fora, the international scene, the UN, in order to shift population, encourage allies to stay allies, to encourage neutrals to become allies or at least stay out of the fight. There's all this maneuvering that you need to be able to do outside of the actual theater of war in order to prevail in a conflict like this, because the Hamas is doing the exact same thing. Hamas is using the external maneuver. They rely on the external maneuver. You have to do your external maneuver of your own, at the very least to counter the external maneuver of the enemy. Now, looking at Gaza, Beaufre might say that Israel executed a direct strategy of material force, large-scale airstrikes and deep ground incursions, intended to physically destroy Hamas's war machine. But it did this in a highly constrained political environment because it was dependent on U.S. support. It was under intense global media scrutiny. It faced all sorts of legal limits and diplomatic limits. This is super dangerous. He said that if you try to run a direct strategy under constraints like this, it's not short. Got to be a short fight. You risk sliding into prolonged attrition that ultimately is going to make the conflict go against your interests. The price is going to be too high. This is very close to what happened in Gaza. It was meant to be a fast, destructive campaign, but it became a long, grinding war. The costs grew, casualties, economic strain, diplomatic isolation, legal exposure. Israel's freedom of action shrank over time as international pressure mounted. And then rather than expanding as a successful total strategy should. The point of strategy is to expand your freedom of action, your liberty of action. But actually what's happened is that Israel's liberty of action is much more limited. Just look at the role that Trump has played in terms of turning the war on and off. Trump's been putting the brakes on Israeli actions in a way that serves his interests and not Israel's. Strategically speaking, that kind of situation is completely disastrous. Beaufre would also zero in on the missing political end state. He'd ask, what is Israel's concrete political objective in Gaza? Is it total elimination of Hamas as a governing and military force? Is it the temporary neutralization of Hamas? Is it a handover to some alternative authority? Because again, strategy for him begins with that answer. If your true aim is to destroy Hamas as a governing structure, he'd argue that an enemy-centric military campaign without a parallel political project and diplomatic framework for a post-war Gaza is unlikely to achieve it, no matter how successful the IDF is tactically. And if the real aim is more modest, just restoring deterrence and buying time, he'd question whether or not the cost to Israel, the devastating campaign with the huge diplomatic blowback, represents a sound economy of force, whether or not, I mean, the blowback is so great that it's hard to argue that it was worth the effort ultimately. And I think finally he would say that Israel traded long-term strategic freedom of action for a short-term kinetic effect. So for instance, you've got all the Tnufa tools, the ghost units, the networks, the AI, which gave it incredible tactical freedom to do all sorts of amazing things. But the choice to do this, to sustain this super high-intensity, high-casualty operation in Gaza, generated political and psychological effects, worldwide criticism, radicalization, pressure from allies that reduced Israel's options for the future. So then the whole thing's a failure. And then from this point of view, also there's a profound strategic imbalance between means and ends. The means have delivered something that is the opposite of the end. So to put it all together, I would argue that Israel's concept of victory and Tnufa represent a serious attempt to adopt to a world of Hezbollah and Hamas, these rocket-based terror armies in cities and tunnels. They redefine victory around achievement, time, and price. They push the IDF towards this very high-speed, multi-domain networked warfare that tries to destroy the enemy systems super quickly at tolerable costs. But in Gaza, while we've seen a lot of this stuff at work at a tactical level, at the campaign level, the war was longer, costlier, and not at all decisive in any way. And this is not what the Doctrine envisioned. Through André Beaufre's lens, I would say that this whole thing looks like an impressive operational innovation plugged into a weak or non-existent total strategy. Thus, too much direct force, not enough indirect political maneuver, a mismatch between means and ends, a complete negligence of the political track, and a pattern where tactical success simply does not automatically translate into a stable strategic outcome. It almost seems self-evident, obvious, that the way they're persecuting in the war was not going to translate into a stable strategic outcome because of the emphasis on force and the emphasis on tactics and the confusion of the means with the end. Now, whether or not Israel can adjust, aligning its powerful new tools with a clear political strategy that both would recognize as a true total strategy, that's a really big open question. I, however, am skeptical because of the impasse that we've already seen within the Israeli government in terms of deciding what kind of desired political end state it really wants. It almost looks as if the political end state is just maintenance of the status quo. And if that's true, then ultimately this whole thing was nothing but another lawn mowing adventure, or misadventure, I should say, which is not a happy thought. I hope you liked this video. Again, please hit like and subscribe. Also in the description, you'll see links to my social media. I'm on X, Blue Sky, LinkedIn, my own website, michaelshirkin.com. And I also have a Substack, which is also called Pax Americana, and I try to write for that once a week. There's plenty more in the pipeline, so stay tuned. Thank you.